Hey gang, Neil here, back once again. So we left off with the last video with the second part of the cast painting of the mouth, going over the three stages of the painting, fill, form, and finish. I kind of teased at some point maybe I would do a brush mark demo, so I think that's what we'll do today. I've been promising a short video, and this should at least fulfill that promise. Certainly shorter than the rest. So, off we go. Different types of brush marks. We have our palette, as always, is ready. 11 values laid out, 10 being white, 0 being our neutral black, and then 9 grays in between, and canvas ready. You can actually see the title of the first one. I wrote it and then restarted the video, so I had to wipe it off. So there are 3 stages of the painting: fill, form, and finish, and there are 3 basic types of brush marks I have categorized: smearing, stroking, and stippling. So first one, smearing. And the difference between the brush marks really has to do with the amount of pressure, how much of the head of the brush that you're using when you're doing the particular type of mark. So smearing is the first type of brush mark. Smearing, there are 2 types of smears. Number 1 is called, my value here, rubbing. Right? Rubbing is when you are engaging the full head of the brush. As soon as you hit the canvas, a little more medium in here so it flows, you are moving across multiple directions, filling the area as fast as possible and loosely, right? From either thick to thin. But smearing is rapidly moving across the surface, engaging the whole head of the brush, moving in multiple directions, filling rapidly, right? That's called rubbing. Obviously, you can imagine where this would be good, certainly not in making any particular type of form, but for backgrounds, filling large areas, rubbing because you're hitting, moving in multiple directions, engaging the full head of the brush, and attempting to move rapidly to cover a large amount of territory. So the first type of smear is rubbing. The second type of smear is called daubing, D-A-U-B-I-N-G. So you're still rapidly moving across the canvas, except instead of hitting the canvas and continuing in that zigzag fashion without pulling up, I'm tapping at the canvas rapidly, engaging the whole head of the brush, picking up, engaging the whole head of the brush, picking up, and so on. So I'm still filling an area rapidly, but because I'm at least picking it up and putting it down, I have a little more control over the area that I'm covering, or the paint that I'm putting down, right? It's not as indiscriminate or random or fast as that. I'm being a little more deliberate with the mark making, engaging the whole head of the brush up and back, engaging, pulling off rapidly, moving across, right? So again, with the daubing, I'm able to cover a large amount of territory, but it is better because it's a little more controlled work with the brush, better for more delicate areas where I want to move quickly, but I still want to retain some element of drawing or shape, where this is really just about moving quickly to cover large territory, large amounts of canvas, period. This is still covering large amounts, but it's a little more exacting because I'm hitting with the brush and picking up, hitting with the brush and picking up. Perfect example of someone who used this daubing mark to quite a degree, to an extensive degree, is Jacques-Louis David, early 19th century neoclassical French painter. If you look at his underpaintings, his early stages of his paintings, the daubing stroke is very clear throughout the entire thing. So, first type of brush mark is smearing. There are 2 types of smears, rubbing and daubing. Again, the idea behind smearing is that you're engaging the entire head of the brush, moving rapidly, covering large amounts of territory. I'm going to have to move my canvas up here. So smearing, second type of brush mark is stroking. Number 2. And if smearing is where you're engaging the entire head of the brush, now we're going to get a little more particular. We're going to engage the tip of the brush and the head of the brush in its entirety with different types of strokes. So just like there are 2 types of smears, rubbing and daubing, there are 3 types of strokes. It all has to do with the amount of pressure you're putting on the tip of your brush. The first stroke is called the even-handed. And the even-handed stroke can either be thin or thick. But the gist of the stroke is, I'm going to switch to a smaller brush, right? I used a larger brush for the smearing because I'm trying to cover large amounts of territory. Stroking, I'm being a little more delicate with my brushwork. Stroking, the first type of stroke of the 3 types of strokes, even-handed, thin or thick, right? And the gist of the even-handed is just like it sounds. I'm using an even amount of pressure, either thin or thick. I'm engaging a consistent amount of pressure on the tip of the brush without changing it. So it can be either thin or thick, straight, thin or thick, curved. Same amount of pressure on the tip of the brush. Now, of course, I'm making these strokes a lot larger than you would typically use for smaller paintings, but just for the sample purposes and so it's clear, I'm exaggerating the size of these. Of course, if I was working a life-size figure, a life-size portrait, there might be areas where I was actually able to make strokes this size, but more often than not, it's a lot smaller, and it's always dependent on the size of your painting. So the first type of stroke is the even-handed, either thin or thick. I'm applying the same amount of pressure, either very little pressure, so the stroke is consistent width, or a lot of pressure where the stroke is consistently wide, not narrow. That's stroke 1. Stroke 2 is thin to thick, thick to thin. This is categorized as the same type of stroke because the idea is that you're either starting with light pressure and then applying heavier pressure, or starting with heavier pressure and pulling off. The idea being that there's one end of the stroke that's light, the other end of the stroke is heavy. So, thin to thick. Start with little pressure and increase as you go. Thin to thick. Start light. Apply pressure. And of course, that could be straight or curved. Start light pressure, end heavy, right? Start light, apply pressure. That is thin to thick. You can imagine then the other half of this stroke, thick to thin, is starting with pressure, heavy pressure, and then lifting off. Starting with heavy pressure and lifting off. Straight or curved. Starting heavy, lifting. Starting heavy, lifting. So, even-handed, consistent amount of pressure, either thin or thick. Thin to thick, thick to thin, either light to heavy pressure or heavy to light pressure. And finally, number 3, move this over a little bit. Number 3 in our strokes is thin to thick to thin. Up, move it over even a little bit more. Where in this case, I'm starting light applying pressure, and pulling off again. Right? It's also called the leaf or living stroke. Leaf or living because all living things taper and flare, right? They narrow and widen and then narrow again. And of course, this can be straight or curved. So thin, light pressure, engage the whole tip of the brush, pull off again. Again, it might be hard to imagine where you'd be using these, especially if you're doing small scale paintings. But even with small brushes, it's a matter of application. I keep saying the whole point here is it's the amount of pressure you're putting on the tip of the brush. Either engaging the entire thing with a smear, where you're moving rapidly, engaging the whole head of the brush. Stroking, where you're getting a little more delicate with your brush marks. You're applying an even amount of pressure, either thin or thick, a light amount to thick, a light amount to heavy, heavy to light, and finally light to heavy to light again. The larger the paintings, and certainly if you look in museums at large-scale figurative paintings, you'll probably see some of these strokes that they were using. And really, if you think about it, if any of you have done pen and ink work with a nib, this really, kind of points to what you can do with the pen nib, creating variations in the weight of the stroke to create differences in the widths of the amount of the brush mark. So we have smearing, which is rubbing and daubing, stroking, even-handed, thin to thick, thick to thin, thin to thick to thin. Got to come up with better names for these. And finally, and maybe some of you can guess, right, if this is all about the amount of pressure that you use on the tip of or that you use on the brush, we went from engaging the entire head of the brush with smearing, engaging the tip and the entire head for stroking, so we're getting smaller and more detailed. Number 3 is stippling. Stippling, then, is using only the tip. Right? Beating or stabbing at the tip or at the canvas with the tip of your brush. Right? If any of you have done any stenciling, very similar, except with a stencil brush, I think they're usually wide and flat. Stippling, whatever brush you have in your hand, you are just using the tip of the brush. So we went from smearing, applying the entire head, stroking, applying a little bit of the tip and then the full head, down to the smallest, which is stippling, where you are only using the tip of the brush. As a matter of fact, there's a similarity in the action. Let me drop this a little bit. Actually, it'd be easier to zoom out. I think that would be easier. There's a similarity between stippling and daubing in what you're doing, pardon me, where you are stabbing at the canvas. The difference is daubing, you're using the whole head of the brush to make broader marks and moving rapidly. Stippling is where you're just using the head, making smaller marks, but the same action. You're stabbing or stabbing at the canvas or beating the canvas with the tip of the brush. So three basic types of marks: smearing, rubbing and daubing, right? 2 types of smears. Stroking, 3 types of strokes: even-handed, thin to thick, thick to thin, thin to thick to thin, and stippling. Entire head of the brush used, tip and head of the brush, just the tip. And that's it. So now that you at least have 3 categories, and it's not to say that this is the only 3 ways you can put paint down, but now you at least have 3 categories to think about as you're working, as you engage various amounts of pressure of the brush for different purposes. And now that you have 3 names too, and you've got some different things to look for the next time you go to a museum and you see a painting that you like in oil, take a look, see if you can get close enough to see what type of paint marks were used. If things haven't been, blended to a great degree, then you might actually see some of these come forward. I know certainly painters that I enjoy, Tiepolo being one in particular, with his vigorous brush marks. You can often see, elements of these various paint marks in his paintings in particular, but you can certainly see them in other artists as well. So 3 types of paint marks, And there's a loose association with the paint marks with the stages of the painting. The fill stage, broad and general, where you're applying your modeling factors quickly to try to lay value over the entire thing. Value if you're just using monochrome, full color if it's obviously full color. But fill stage, you're looking to move across the surface quickly and broadly to state the general value structure. That's typically when you might be using a smear, so that you're moving quickly and covering areas quickly. Forming stage, right? You're going back into your fill and getting a little more detailed, making forms in the broad light that you painted. That's where you might do more stroking, right? Using the tip and the full head to begin to model the interior forms. And then finally stippling, your finishing stage, where you're going back in and making small drawing or hue value and chroma adjustments. That's it. Short video this week. Next week we will continue with something. Like and subscribe if you appreciate the videos. As I mentioned, if you have any suggestions or requests for anything to work on, drop them in the comment box, and I'll see you soon. Ciao.